the merchant of moonbeams. In the ancient city of Varanasi, where the Ganges whispered secrets to the stars, lived a merchant named Kalindi, who traded not in silk or spices, but in worries. Each night, she would collect the anxieties of the townspeople, storing them in small clay vessels that lined the walls of her modest dwelling. Her customers would arrive at dusk, their minds heavy with the day's burdens, and leave feeling lighter, their troubles now contained within Kalindi's careful keeping. Kalindi had learned this peculiar trade from her grandmother, who had learned it from hers, in an unbroken chain stretching back to the time when the Buddha himself walked these very streets. The secret, her grandmother had whispered, was not in the taking of worries, but in the understanding that they were merely visitors, not permanent residents of the heart. One evening, as monsoon clouds gathered overhead, a young monk named Bodhan arrived at Kalindi's door. Unlike her usual customers, he carried no visible burden, yet something in his eyes spoke of a deeper unrest. He moved with the measured steps of one who had spent years in meditation, his saffron robes rustling softly in the evening breeze. "I seek not to give you my troubles," Bodhan said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but to understand why I feel them stirring even after years of practice. I have mastered the art of sitting in stillness, yet my mind refuses to find peace when night falls." Kalindi studied the young monk's face, seeing in it the same restless energy that had once plagued her own nights. She gestured for him to sit on the simple wooden mat beside her collection of worry vessels, each one emanating a soft, almost imperceptible hum in the gathering darkness. "Tell me, Bodhan," she said, settling herself across from him, "what does your training teach you about the nature of thoughts? That they arise and pass away like clouds across the sky." He replied automatically, the words carrying the weight of countless repetitions, that we must observe them without attachment, allowing them to float by without grasping. And yet, Kalindi observed, reaching for one of her vessels, "Here you sit, grasping at the very idea of not grasping. Your mind has made a problem of having problems creating a storm. From the very clouds you seek to watch peacefully." She opened the small clay container, and from it emerged not the darkness Bodhan expected, but a gentle shimmering light that danced between her fingers like captured starlight. The monk's eyes widened as the light began to take shape, forming tiny figures that moved with the fluid grace of smoke given form. "Each worry I collect," Kalindi explained, "reveals itself to be something else entirely when held with proper understanding. Watch." The dancing figures began to tell their own story, moving through scenes of daily life. A farmer, concerned about his crops, a mother worried for her child's safety, a scholar doubting his wisdom. As Bodhan watched, he began to see not the specific content of each worry, but the underlying current that connected them all, the deep fundamental caring that drove each concern. The farmer's anxiety sprang from love of his family, the mother's fear from fierce protectiveness, the scholar's doubt from genuine desire for truth. Your nighttime restlessness, Kalindi, continued as more vessels were opened and their contents revealed, is not a failure of your practice, but perhaps its deepest expression. In the stillness you've cultivated, you've become sensitive enough to feel not just your own subtle tensions, but the trembling of the world itself. The monk felt something shift in his understanding, like a door opening in a room he hadn't known was closed. Then the solution is not to eliminate this sensitivity. The lotus blooms most beautifully in muddy water. Kalindi smiled, gathering the dancing lights back into their vessels with gentle, practiced movements. Your awareness of disturbance is not separate from peace. It is peace becoming more refined, more capable of embracing all things without being overwhelmed by them. She stood and moved to a special shelf where a single larger vessel sat apart from the others. This one seemed to contain not light, but a depth that drew the eye inward, like looking into still water under moonlight. This vessel holds what I call the master worry, the fear that we are not spiritual enough, not peaceful enough, not enlightened enough. Nearly every seeker who finds their way to my door carries some version of this burden. Bodhan recognized the truth in her words, feeling the familiar weight of spiritual perfectionism that had driven him to seek ever deeper states of meditation, ever greater control over his inner landscape. How does one release this most persistent of visitors? By inviting it to tea. Kalindi laughed softly, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The Buddha himself, in the nights following his awakening, was visited by doubt, by fear, by all manner of mental formations. But he had learned the secret of perfect hospitality, to welcome each visitor fully, without trying to change or dismiss them, until they naturally revealed their gifts and departed of their own accord. She handed Bodhan a small empty vessel, its clay surface smooth and warm to the touch. Tonight, when restlessness comes to call, do not meet it at the gate with resistance. Instead, prepare a place for it beside your meditation cushion. Offer it the same patient attention you would give an honored guest. Ask it what it has come to teach you. The young monk accepted the vessel, feeling its weight. Not heavy, but substantial, like holding a promise. And then you listen with the ears of the heart. Kalindi replied, beginning to arrange her collection for the night's work. Other visitors would come before dawn, each carrying their own unique configuration of human concern. You'll discover that restlessness, when truly heard, often speaks of unacknowledged compassion, unexpressed creativity, or simply the soul's deep longing for authentic connection with itself, with others, with the sacred mystery of existence. As if summoned by their conversation, the first drops of monsoon rain began to fall, creating a gentle percussion on the roof tiles above. Bodhan rose to leave, but paused at the threshold, turning back with one final question. In all your years of collecting worries, what have you learned is their deepest teaching? Kalindi smiled her eyes, reflecting the soft glow of the vessels around her. That every anxiety, every fear, every restless thought is simply love in disguise. Love that has forgotten its own nature and believes itself to be alone. When we remember this, even our deepest troubles become doorways to compassion, first for ourselves, then for all beings who share in the beautiful difficulty of being human. The monk walked home through the gentle rain, his clay vessel cradled carefully in his palms, understanding that he carried not just a tool for his own peace, but a reminder of his connection to every worried heart that had ever sought rest in the embrace of a quiet night. The lesson settled into his awareness, like rain soaking into grateful earth. True peace arises not from the absence of disturbance, but from the recognition that disturbance and tranquility arise from the same source, like waves and ocean temporary formations in the vast unchanging depth of compassionate awareness. The weaver of silent songs. In the mountain village of Dharamkot, where prayer flags fluttered like captured dreams against the Himalayan sky, there lived a weaver named Tenzin, whose looms produced no cloth, but silence itself. Her workshop stood at the edge of the village, where the last house gave way to terraced fields that stepped down the mountainside, like a giant staircase carved from earth and hope. Tenzin had discovered her unusual gift, quite by accident, during a period of profound grief following the loss of her husband to a sudden illness. Unable to find comfort in words or conventional weaving, she had begun working her loom in complete silence, letting her hands move without conscious direction. What emerged was not fabric, but spaces between sounds. Pockets of quietude so pure and healing, that birds would cease their chatter when passing her window, and even the mountain wind would pause to listen. Word of the silent weaver spread gradually through the valley, carried not by gossip, but by the inexplicable sense of peace that visitors felt in her presence. People began arriving at her door, not seeking cloth, but seeking rest from the constant chatter of their own minds. Tenzin would invite them to sit beside her loom, where the rhythmic motion of her work seemed to gradually untangle the knots of their restless thoughts. On this particular evening, as twilight painted the peaks in shades of rose and gold, a traveling merchant named Pemba arrived at Tenzin's workshop. Unlike most visitors who came seeking peace, Pemba carried with him an urgent energy, a restlessness that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. He was a man accustomed to constant motion, to the endless cycle of buying and selling, negotiating and traveling that had defined his life for 3 decades. "I have heard," Pemba said, barely pausing for proper greetings, "that you weave silence. I need this thing you create, but I need it quickly. My mind has not known rest for months, and I must travel again at dawn. Can you sell me some small portion of what you make?" Tenzin smiled gently, her fingers never pausing in their work as she guided threads through the complex pattern, taking shape on her loom. "Silence cannot be sold, friend Pemba, any more than you could purchase the space between your heartbeats. But it can be shared, experienced, allowed to emerge naturally from the stillness that already exists within you." The merchant shifted impatiently his hands, unconsciously reaching for the prayer beads he carried for business luck rather than devotion. "I have tried meditation, sitting practice, chanting breathing exercises. Nothing calms this constant movement in my head. My thoughts race like horses that have forgotten their rider. Surely what you create here is different, more powerful. Sit with me for a moment," Tenzin invited, gesturing to a simple cushion beside her loom. "Let me show you something about the nature of racing thoughts and the silence that contains them." Reluctantly, Pemba settled himself on the cushion, his body rigid with the effort of trying to be still. Tenzin's hands continued their ancient dance across the loom, but now she began to speak softly, her words weaving themselves into the rhythm of her work. "When I first learned to weave cloth," she said, "I believed that the beauty lay in the threads themselves, their color, their texture, their strength. I would focus intensely on each strand, trying to make everyone perfect, fighting with knots and inconsistencies. The work was exhausting, and the fabric that resulted, though technically correct, lacked something essential." As she spoke, Pemba found himself drawn into the hypnotic motion of her hands, the gentle clicking of the shuttle, the way threads appeared and disappeared into the growing pattern. Despite himself, his breathing began to slow, matching the rhythm of her movements. "One day," Tenzin continued, "my teacher asked me a simple question. What holds the threads together? I answered immediately, the weaving the pattern, my skill. But she shook her head and pointed to the loom itself. The threads exist in relationship to the emptiness between them, she said. Remove the spaces, and you have no fabric at all, only a solid mass of fiber. The empty spaces are not absent. They are present in a different way." The merchant felt something shifting in his chest, a loosening he hadn't experienced in months. "You're saying that silence is not the absence of thought, but what exactly the awareness in which thoughts appear and disappear?" Tenzin replied, her voice now barely above a whisper. "Just as this fabric depends on the spaces between threads, your peace of mind depends not on eliminating thoughts, but on recognizing the spacious awareness that witnesses their coming and going." She gestured to her loom, where an intricate mandala pattern was taking shape. its design emerging from the interplay of colored threads and empty spaces. Each thought that races through your mind is like one of these threads, pursued alone, grasped at individually. It seems to have great importance, great urgency, but stepped back and seen in the context of the whole pattern, each thread finds its proper place in a larger design. Pemba closed his eyes, and for the first time in months, allowed his thoughts to simply be present, without trying to control or direct them. Concerns about upcoming business deals, worries about family members, plans for the next day's journey, all continued to arise, but somehow they no longer seemed to demand his complete attention. They were threads in a larger weaving temporary formations, in a space that remained fundamentally undisturbed by their presence. But how do I carry this understanding with me when I travel? He asked, opening his eyes to meet Tenzin's gentle gaze. My life requires constant movement, decision-making engagement with the world of commerce and negotiation. Tenzin reached into a small basket beside her loom and withdrew what appeared to be a simple length of cloth. But as she unfolded it, Pemba saw that it was woven entirely from different shades of white and cream so subtle that the pattern was almost invisible, revealed only by the way light played across its surface. This is what I call a silence cloth, she explained, placing it in his hands. I weave these for travelers like yourself, people whose lives require them to be in constant motion. The pattern is invisible to casual observation, but when you touch it, when you really look, you begin to see the spaces between threads, the emptiness that gives the fabric its strength and flexibility. The cloth felt impossibly soft and light in Pemba's hands, yet there was something substantial about it, as if it contained more than its physical form suggested. How does it work? Each morning and evening, spend just a few moments holding it, letting your fingers trace the nearly invisible pattern. As you do, remember that your thoughts, no matter how urgent or important they seem, are like threads in a larger design that you cannot see from your current perspective. The cloth will remind you that the peace you seek is not somewhere else, not something to be achieved or acquired, but the very awareness through which you experience each moment. As night deepened around them, Tenzin lit a small oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls of her workshop. There is one more thing you must understand, she said, returning to her loom for a few final passes of the shuttle. The silence I weave is not my creation. It already exists, everywhere, in everyone. My work simply removes the distractions, the knots and tangles that prevent us from recognizing what was never absent. Pemba carefully folded the silence cloth and tucked it into his traveling pouch, feeling a lightness he had almost forgotten was possible. Will I see you again? When I return through this valley, you carry the loom with you now. Tenzin smiled, her work for the evening complete. Every moment offers you the choice to see your experiences as isolated threads, demanding urgent attention, or as part of a vast, beautiful pattern, being woven by wisdom far greater than our individual understanding. The merchant bowed deeply before stepping back into the mountain night, the silence cloth a gentle weight against his side. Above him, stars emerged in the clear sky, like holes punched through dark fabric, revealing the light that had always been shining behind appearances. As he walked toward his simple lodging, Pemba understood that he had learned the deepest lesson of all. Peace is not something we must create or achieve, but rather our natural state when we stop trying so hard to weave our lives according to patterns of our own limited design, and instead trust the larger intelligence that guides each thread to its perfect place in the infinite tapestry of existence. The gardener of forgotten dreams. In the ancient forest of Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha himself had once sat beneath the Bodhi tree, there lived a gardener named Ashana who tended not flowers or vegetables, but dreams that had been abandoned by their dreamers. Her garden existed in a clearing that seemed to shift location depending on who sought it, appearing only to those whose hearts carried the particular ache of unfulfilled longing. Ashana had inherited this sacred work from her predecessor, an old woman who had appeared in her own dreams during a time of great personal loss. Years ago, Ashana had been a renowned architect, designing temples and palaces that reached toward the heavens with mathematical precision and artistic beauty. But a devastating earthquake had destroyed her greatest creation just days before its completion, and with it her faith in the permanence of any human achievement. In her despair, she had wandered into this very forest seeking solitude for her grief. There she had discovered the garden in its wild, untended state, dreams growing like weeds, intertwining and choking each other, their original beauty obscured by neglect and confusion. The old gardener had emerged from this tangle like a spirit materialized from morning mist, her eyes holding depths that seemed to reflect every sorrow and joy the world had ever known. Dreams. The old woman had explained leading Ashana through pathways that seemed to reshape themselves with each step, are not meant to be possessed or achieved. They are seeds of possibility planted in human hearts to guide us toward our deepest truth. When a dreamer abandons their vision out of fear or disappointment, the dream continues to exist, waiting patiently for someone to tend it back to health. Now, after 15 years of this mysterious work, Ashana had learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when someone was approaching her garden. The quality of light would shift, becoming softer and more golden. Birds would begin singing in harmonies that seemed almost too complex for their small throats. And always, there would be the sound of footsteps on the forest path, hesitant, weary, belonging to someone who had lost their way in more ways than one. This evening, as monsoon clouds gathered overhead, like questions waiting to be asked, those familiar footsteps announced the arrival of a young woman named Kamala. She moved through the forest with the careful gait of someone who had learned not to trust the ground beneath her feet. Her artist's hands clutched tightly around a worn leather portfolio that she pressed against her chest like armor. Kamala had once been a painter whose canvases captured light in ways that made viewers forget to breathe. Her work had adorned galleries in distant cities, and collectors had competed for pieces that seemed to contain actual fragments of sunrise-sunset and the mysterious luminescence that exists only in the space between day and night. But success had brought scrutiny, criticism, and eventually a paralysis that left her unable to lift a brush without drowning in self-doubt. "I seek the gardener," Kamala announced, to the seemingly empty clearing, her voice barely louder than the whisper of leaves overhead. "I have been told that here lost things might be found." Ashana emerged from behind a grove of trees whose trunks seemed to spiral upward like frozen dancers, their branches heavy with fruit that shifted color and form as she watched. "Welcome, daughter," she said, though Kamala was clearly older than herself. "What brings you to my garden in this time between seasons?" "I have lost my ability to create," Kamala replied, lowering her portfolio but keeping it close. "For 2 years, I have not completed a single painting. Every time I begin, I hear voices, critics, collectors, even my own inner voice, telling me that what I'm creating is not good enough, not original enough, not worthy of the reputation I once carried. I come here hoping you might help me find my way back to the joy I once knew in making art." Ashana studied the young woman's face, seeing in it the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting a war against one's own creative spirit. "Before we explore your garden," she said gently, Tell me about the last painting you loved creating, regardless of what others thought of it. Kamala's expression softened slightly, and for the first time since her arrival, her grip on the portfolio loosened. It was a small canvas, painted during a storm. I had been trapped in a mountain cabin for 3 days, with nothing but basic supplies and cheap paints. I painted the lightning as it illuminated the valley below, not trying to capture its exact appearance, but the feeling of being witness to such raw power. I remember laughing as I worked completely alone, painting for no one but myself and the storm. And where is this painting now? Hidden in my studio. I convinced myself it was amateur work, unworthy of showing anyone. Kamala's voice carried the weight of a confession she had never made aloud. Ashana nodded knowingly and began walking deeper into the garden, gesturing for Kamala to follow. They passed through sections where different categories of dreams grew in carefully tended plots. Abandoned love letters that had never been sent grew alongside unwritten symphonies. Architectural plans for impossible buildings shared space with recipes for dishes that existed only in imagination. Children's drawings of fantastical creatures flourished next to detailed plans for journeys never taken. Here, Ashana said, stopping before a section of the garden that seemed to shimmer with its own internal light, are the dreams of artists who have forgotten that creation is not about product, but about participation in the eternal dance of possibility becoming manifest. In this plot, Kamala saw paintings that seemed to paint themselves brushstrokes, appearing and disappearing like thoughts taking visible form, sculptures that shifted and reformed as she watched, never settling into final shapes, musical compositions that could be heard, not with the ears, but with some deeper faculty of perception melodies that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. These dreams belong to creators who have become convinced that their worth depends on external validation. Ashana explained, kneeling to tend a small plant whose flowers opened and closed in rhythm with an unheard heartbeat. They have forgotten that the urge to create is itself sacred, regardless of whether the creation meets any external standard of success or significance. Kamala knelt beside her, finally setting down her portfolio and opening it to reveal dozens of sketches and partially completed paintings. Each one showed evidence of being started with enthusiasm and then abandoned when self-doubt took hold. How do I return to that pure impulse to create? How do I silence the voices that tell me my work isn't good enough? You don't silence them. Ashana smiled her hands, working with practiced efficiency to clear weeds from around the dream plants. You invite them to tea, just as the merchant Kalindi taught the young monk Bodhan in the city below our mountain. And you remember that these voices, like all difficult visitors, often carry gifts disguised as burdens. She guided Kamala's attention to a particular plant whose blooms seemed to contain actual scenes, tiny landscapes, portraits, abstract patterns that shifted and evolved as they watched. Watch carefully, Ashana instructed. What do you see? The images keep changing, Kamala observed, leaning closer. Each bloom shows something different, but they're all beautiful in their own way. Even the ones that seem unfinished or imperfect have something precious about them. This plant grows from the dreams of an artist who learned to see criticism not as judgment, but as information. Each critical voice, whether internal or external, points toward some aspect of the creative process that wants deeper attention. The harsh inner critic often masks a profound devotion to excellence. The fear of imperfection often conceals a deep reverence for beauty. The anxiety about originality frequently hides an authentic desire to contribute something meaningful to the world. As if responding to their conversation, the garden around them began to glow more brightly, and Kamala realized that the light was coming not from any external source, but from the dreams themselves, each one radiating the particular frequency of its dreamer's deepest longing. "There is a practice," Ashana continued, rising and brushing soil from her hands, "that I learned from the old gardener who taught me this work. Each morning, before you touch brush to canvas, sit quietly and ask your creative spirit what it wants to explore today. Not what you think you should paint, not what might sell or impress others, but what wants to emerge through you in this particular moment." She handed Kamala a small seed that seemed to contain its own miniature galaxy, swirling with colors that had no names. "Plant this in your studio, in a small pot beside your easel. Water it not with water, but with attention to the joy of the creative process itself. As it grows, it will remind you that every true artist is simply a gardener of possibilities, tending visions until they're ready to bloom into the world." The evening light was beginning to fade, and somewhere in the distance, temple bells rang the hour of meditation. Kamala carefully wrapped the seed in a piece of cloth from her portfolio. Understanding that she carried more than a plant beginning, she carried a new relationship with her own creative nature. "Will the voices of doubt and criticism disappear?" she asked, as they walked back toward the garden's entrance. "They will transform," Ashana replied, pausing at the edge of the clearing, where the ordinary forest resumed. "When you no longer fight them, they become allies rather than enemies. The voice that once whispered, 'This isn't good enough,' becomes a gentle guide, helping you refine your vision. The fear of judgment transforms into discernment. The anxiety about originality becomes a compass pointing toward your most authentic expression." As Kamala stepped back onto the forest path, her portfolio felt lighter in her hands, though its contents remained unchanged. Above her, the first stars were becoming visible through the canopy, each one a distant reminder that even in vast darkness, points of light find ways to shine. She understood now that creativity is not about producing perfect works, but about remaining open to the endless flow of inspiration that moves through all things, trusting that when we tend our inner garden with patience and compassion, what emerges will always be exactly what the world needs from us in that moment. The keeper of unspoken words, deep in the bamboo forests of Kyoto, where ancient temples stood like patient sentinels among the swaying groves, there lived a librarian named Yukiko, who collected not books, but words that had never been spoken aloud. Her library existed in a structure that seemed to grow from the bamboo itself, its walls alive and breathing with the rhythm of the forest shelves, carved from living wood, that continued to sprout new growth, even as they held their precious contents. Yukiko had discovered her calling during a period of profound silence, following a childhood illness that had temporarily stolen her voice. In those months of enforced quietude, she had learned to hear the subtle music of unexpressed thoughts, the gentle humming of words that lingered in people's hearts, but never found their way to their lips. She realized that these unspoken words carried as much power as those that filled the air with sound, sometimes more. The library's collection grew organically, words arriving like seeds on the wind whenever someone nearby struggled with something they needed to say, but could not. Love confessions that died in the throat from fear of rejection. Apologies that remained locked behind pride. Words of gratitude that seemed too small to contain the vastness of feeling they represented. Each unspoken word found its way to Yukiko's shelves, where it was carefully cataloged and tended until its speaker was ready to give it voice. On this particular evening, as cherry blossoms drifted past the library's open windows, like snow made of dreams, a poet named Hiroshi arrived at Yukiko's door. He was a man whose published verses had earned him recognition throughout Japan, yet he carried himself with the hunched shoulders of someone bearing an invisible weight. His eyes held the particular sadness of one who had mastered the art of beautiful expression, but had somehow lost access to simple, honest speech. "I seek the keeper of unspoken words." Hiroshi said, his voice formal, and carefully modulated each syllable, placed with the precision of a master calligrapher. "I have been told that here words that have lost their way might find their proper home." Yukiko emerged from the depths of her library, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to navigate by listening rather than looking. Around her neck hung a collection of small wind chimes, each one tuned to a different frequency of unexpressed emotion. As she moved, they created a soft symphony that seemed to encourage the walls themselves to lean in and listen. "Welcome, word worker," she said, her own voice carrying the musical quality that often develops in those who choose their words with exceptional care. "Tell me, what words have you lost? Or perhaps what words have lost you?" Hiroshi's carefully composed expression wavered slightly, revealing beneath it the face of someone much younger and more vulnerable than his public persona suggested. "I have spent years crafting verses that speak of love loss, beauty, transcendence. My poems are read in universities, translated into foreign languages, analyzed by scholars. But I have not spoken a single honest word to another human being in longer than I can remember." He paused, looking around the library with wonder. The shelves seemed to stretch impossibly high, filled not with bound volumes, but with what appeared to be crystallized breath, small translucent containers that held the essence of words waiting to be born. Some glowed with warm light, others seemed to contain their own weather systems, complete with tiny storms and moments of perfect clarity. 3 years ago," Hiroshi continued, "my father died without ever hearing me tell him that I loved him. The words existed perfectly formed every time I visited him in the hospital, but they remained trapped behind my trained poet's tongue, which knew how to speak of love in metaphor and meter, but had forgotten how to simply say, 'I love you, Father.'" Yukiko nodded with deep understanding, her wind chimes responding to his words with a soft, mournful melody. "Follow me," she said, leading him through aisles that seemed to reorganize themselves as they walked. "I want to show you something that I believe belongs to you." They traveled deeper into the library, past sections dedicated to children's secret wishes, lovers' midnight confessions, and the final words that people wished they had spoken to those who had passed beyond hearing. Finally, they arrived at a special alcove where a single shelf held containers that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. "These," Yukiko explained, "are words of love between parents and children, words that were felt but never spoken, that lived in glances and small acts of care but never found voice. This collection is particularly precious because these words often carry the full weight of a lifetime's devotion, compressed into simple phrases that we convince ourselves are too obvious to need saying." She reached for a container that seemed to glow with soft golden light, its surface reflecting not their faces, but something deeper, the expression of love that exists before words give it shape. "This one has been waiting for you," she said, placing it gently in Hiroshi's hands. As his fingers closed around the container, Hiroshi felt a warmth that spread from his palms, up through his arms, and into his chest, settling in the place where he had carried the ache of unspoken words for so long. The container seemed to vibrate slightly, like a tuning fork struck against the frequency of his own heart. "But my father is gone," he whispered, his poet's composure finally cracking, to reveal the grief he had been carrying. "These words can never reach him now." "Can they not?" Yukiko asked gently, settling herself on a cushion beside the alcove and gesturing for him to do the same. Tell me, when you read the poems of Rumi or Basho, do you feel that their words reach you across the centuries? When you write your own verses, do you not trust that they will touch hearts you will never meet? The poet considered this feeling the truth of it, settle into his understanding like water soaking into dry earth. You're suggesting that love, once authentically expressed, transcends the boundaries of time and physical presence. I'm suggesting, Yukiko replied, her wind chimes, creating a gentle accompaniment to her words, that the speaking of truth, whether to the living or the dead, whether heard by the intended recipient or carried on the wind, completes something essential in the speaker. Your father may not hear your words with his ears, but the part of him that lives on in your heart, the part of him that shaped who you are, that part is listening still. She guided his attention to the other containers in the alcove, each one containing words that someone had needed to speak, but had kept locked away out of fear, pride, or simple lack of courage. Every day people discover that the person they most needed to speak to is no longer available to receive their words in the conventional sense, but the words themselves, when finally given voice, create a bridge between the world of form and the realm of pure love that exists beyond the reach of loss. Hiroshi opened the container with trembling hands, and from it emerged not sound, but something more fundamental, the feeling that underlies all expressions of love between parent and child. He felt his throat open, his breath deepen, and for the first time in years, simple, honest words rose to his lips, without the ornamental complexity of his trained, poetic voice. "I love you, Father," he said aloud, and the words seemed to fill the library with their own light. "I was proud to be your son. I am grateful for every moment of care you gave me, every sacrifice you made, that I was too young to recognize. I carry your strength with me, and I promise to speak these truths more freely to those who still walk beside me." As he spoke, more containers began to glow throughout the library, as if his courage to voice long-held truths was awakening similar courage in the unspoken words of others. Yukiko smiled, recognizing the phenomenon that occurred whenever someone broke through the barrier between feeling and expression. "There is a practice," she said, rising to tend to the newly awakened words that my teacher shared with me when I first began this work. Each morning, before you engage with the world, sit quietly and ask yourself, what truth wants to be spoken through me today? Then throughout the day, look for opportunities to speak that truth with kindness and courage. She handed him a small empty container, its surface clear as mountain water. "This is for you to carry. When you notice words arising in your heart but hesitating on your tongue, breathe them into this vessel. Then, when you are ready, give them voice. You'll find that words like dreams grow stronger when they are honored rather than hidden." As they prepared to leave the alcove, Hiroshi felt a lightness in his chest that he had not experienced since childhood. The weight of unspoken love that he had carried for years had transformed into something else. Not absence, but completion. The words he had needed to speak had found their way into the world, and in doing so, had opened space for new words, new connections, new expressions of the love that flows continuously through all beings. "Will I see my father again?" he asked, as they walked back through the library toward the entrance. "You see him every time you choose courage over comfort in expressing love," Yukiko replied, her wind chimes singing softly in the evening breeze. "You honor him every time you speak truth instead of hiding behind beautiful but empty phrases, and you continue his presence in the world every time you help others find their own authentic voice." Stepping back into the bamboo forest, Hiroshi understood that he had learned the deepest lesson of all authentic communication words gain their power not from their cleverness or beauty, but from their willingness to serve as bridges between one heart and another, carrying the simple revolutionary truth that we are not alone in this world, that love is always present, and that every moment offers us the opportunity to speak that love into being, whether to the living or the dead, whether to those who stand before us or to the vast listening silence that holds us all. The mender of broken moments. In the floating markets of ancient Ayutthaya, where wooden boats carried more than goods across the serpentine canals, there lived a clockmaker named Narayan, who specialized in repairing not timepieces, but moments that had been shattered by regret. His workshop floated on a houseboat that seemed to drift without direction, yet always appeared exactly where it was needed, most moored beside those whose hearts carried the jagged fragments of what they wished they had done differently. Narayan had learned his unusual craft from his grandfather, a man who had spent his youth as a temple musician before discovering that time itself was the most delicate instrument of all, requiring constant tuning and occasional repair. The old man had taught him that moments like clockwork could be taken apart, examined and reassembled with greater understanding, allowing their hidden beauty to shine through even the cracks left by pain and disappointment. The workshop itself defied conventional understanding of space and function. Shelves lined the walls, filled not with gears and springs, but with crystallized moments, scenes frozen in translucent amber that captured the precise instant when someone's life had pivoted around a single decision, word, or action. Some glowed with warmth, others seemed clouded with shadow, but all pulsed with the particular rhythm of their original moment, waiting for the right combination of wisdom and compassion to restore their proper functioning. This evening, as lotus flowers closed their petals for the night and temple bells echoed across the water from distant shores, a middle-aged woman named Chandra approached Narayan's boat with the careful steps of someone who had learned to mistrust the stability of the ground beneath her feet. She carried herself with the bearing of a former dancer, her spine straight, despite the weight of invisible burdens, her hands moving with unconscious grace, even as they trembled slightly with suppressed emotion. Chandra had once been celebrated throughout the kingdom for her ability to embody the ancient stories through dance, her performances transforming simple temple courtyards into realms where gods and humans moved in perfect harmony. But 15 years ago, on the night of her greatest triumph, she had made a choice that had haunted her ever since. She had chosen personal safety over artistic truth, allowing political pressure to alter a performance that was meant to speak of justice and compassion. "I seek the mender of broken moments," she announced to the seemingly empty houseboat, her voice carrying the trained projection of a performer, even as it wavered with uncertainty. "I have been told that here, what was damaged by poor choices might be understood, if not repaired." Narayan emerged from the depths of his workshop, his hands still dusted with the strange golden powder that accumulated when working with crystallized time. He was younger than most masters of esoteric arts, but his eyes held depths that suggested he had lived many lifetimes in his short years of practice. Around his workshop, hundreds of small chimes hung from the ceiling, each one attuned to a different frequency of human regret, creating a symphony of healing that was audible only to those who truly needed to hear it. "Welcome, graceful one," he said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had learned to speak to the wounded places in human hearts. "Show me the moment that calls for attention, and we will examine it together with the eyes of understanding rather than judgment." Chandra hesitated at the threshold of the workshop, her dancer's instincts recognizing the sacred nature of the space she was about to enter. 15 years ago, she began. I was to perform the story of Sita's trial by fire, her willingness to walk through flames to prove her purity and devotion. The performance was scheduled for the king's court, but just hours before I was to dance, a court official informed me that recent political tensions made the story inappropriate. He suggested I change it to something more decorative. She stepped into the workshop, and immediately the chimes began to respond, their soft tones weaving together into a melody that seemed to acknowledge her pain without trying to minimize it. Narayan listened with the complete attention that his grandfather had taught him was the first requirement for any healing work. I changed the performance. Chandra continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Instead of Sita's courage, I danced a simple celebration of spring flowers. The audience applauded, the king was pleased, and I was rewarded with gold and praise. But I have never forgiven myself for choosing safety over truth, comfort over courage. That moment of decision has poisoned every performance since. Narayan nodded with deep understanding, recognizing the particular quality of regret that comes from betraying one's own deepest values. He moved through his workshop with practiced efficiency, scanning the shelves until he found what he was looking for, a section dedicated to moments when artistic integrity had been compromised by external pressure. Here, he said, retrieving a crystallized moment that seemed to contain its own storm system, swirling with darker and lighter currents that never quite resolved into clarity. This is the moment you speak of. See how it has become trapped in a cycle of self-recrimination, unable to complete its natural evolution into wisdom. As Chandra looked into the crystal, she saw herself as she had been 15 years ago, standing in the preparation chamber behind the performance space costume, half changed her body, frozen between two choices. The scene played out in slow motion, showing not just her external actions, but the tumult of emotions, considerations, and fears that had informed her decision. I see myself choosing cowardice, she said, her voice heavy with familiar self-condemnation. Look more carefully, Narayan instructed, gently adjusting the crystal slightly so that the light revealed different aspects of the frozen scene. What else do you see? What other factors were present in that moment that your regret has trained you to ignore? As Chandra looked deeper, she began to notice details that her years of self-punishment had obscured. She saw the exhaustion in her younger self's face. She had been performing almost continuously for months, supporting not just herself, but her aging parents and younger siblings through her art. She saw the genuine fear in her eyes, not just for her own safety, but for the welfare of her family, who depended on her royal patronage for their survival. I see someone who is trying to balance competing responsibilities, she admitted reluctantly. But surely the right choice would have been to accept the consequences of artistic integrity regardless of the cost. Narayan carefully removed the crystal from its shelf and placed it in a special apparatus that resembled a combination of clockwork mechanism and meditation altar. As he made delicate adjustments to various components, the crystallized moment began to expand, revealing not just the single point of decision, but the entire context that had surrounded it. Watch what happens, he said, when we view this moment not as an isolated choice between good and evil, but as part of a larger pattern of learning that your soul was navigating. As the crystal expanded, its revelation, Chandra saw her entire life spreading out like a mandala around that central moment. She saw the years of training that had led to her skill, the countless small performances that had brought joy to village celebrations, the students she had taught who carried her knowledge forward, the family members whose lives had been sustained by her choices. Your grandfather, the musician, Narayan said, somehow knowing details of her history that she had not shared. What would he have said about the relationship between art and survival? Chandra smiled for the first time since entering the workshop, remembering the old man who had first taught her to move with the rhythm of the ancient stories. He used to say that an artist's first responsibility was to remain alive and capable of creating, because a silenced artist serves no one. He said that sometimes the greatest courage was in choosing to live and create another day, even when that choice looked like compromise. The crystallized moment was beginning to change its internal storm, settling into a more peaceful configuration as new understanding reorganized its structure. Your moment of choice, Narayan explained, was never broken by your decision. It was broken by your refusal to see that decision, with compassion to recognize that every human choice involves trade-offs, and that wisdom often lies not in perfect choices, but in learning from imperfect ones. He made final adjustments to the apparatus, and suddenly, the crystal blazed with clear, warm light. "Look now," he said. "What do you see?" In the transformed moment, Chandra saw her younger self making the choice to change her performance, but now she could see it as an act of practical wisdom rather than moral failure. She saw how that choice had allowed her to continue teaching, to support her family, to plant seeds for future performances that would speak truth when the political climate was more receptive. "But I never did perform Sita's story," she protested. "I never found the courage to return to that level of artistic truth." "Did you not?" Narayan asked, gesturing to another section of his workshop, where newer crystals were displayed. "What about the private classes you have taught for the past 15 years? The young dancers who have learned not just technique from you, but the deeper lesson that art must sometimes be patient, strategic-wise in its timing." As if summoned by his words, several crystals began to glow, showing scenes of Chandra, teaching demonstrating not just the movements of classical dance, but the deeper principles of how art could serve justice without destroying the artist. She saw students who had gone on to create performances that spoke truth precisely because they had learned from her how to balance courage with wisdom. "Your moment of compromise," Narayan said, carefully removing the now clear crystal from the apparatus and placing it in her hands, "was actually a moment of choosing long-term effectiveness over short-term purity. The art form survived through you, evolved through you, and now serves truth in ways that would not have been possible if you had chosen martyrdom that night." As Chandra held the restored moment, she felt a weight she had carried for 15 years, finally lifting from her shoulders. The regret that had poisoned her relationship with her own artistry transformed into something else, a deeper understanding of the complex navigation required by anyone who seeks to serve both truth and survival in an often hostile world. "There is a practice," Narayan said, beginning to clean his tools as evening deepened around them, "that my grandfather taught me for working with moments that seem broken by poor choices. Each morning, instead of asking, 'What did I do wrong?' ask instead, 'What was I trying to protect or serve?' Then ask, 'What did I learn that serves my deeper purpose now?'" He handed her a small empty crystal, clear as water. "When you encounter future moments of difficult choice, and you will, for this is the nature of a life, lived in service to something greater than comfort, remember that every choice carries within it the seeds of both wisdom and regret. The art lies not in making perfect choices, but in learning to see imperfect choices with the compassion that allows them to ripen into wisdom." As Chandra prepared to leave the floating workshop, the temple bells were ringing the hour of evening meditation across the water. She felt in her body a lightness she had not experienced since her youth, as if years of held tension had finally found release. "Will I dance Sita's story now?" she asked. "You have been dancing it for 15 years." Narayan smiled, untying his boat from its mooring as mysteriously as he had arrived. "Every time you chose wisdom over righteousness, patience over impatience, strategic compassion over heroic gesture. The fire you feared to walk through became the forge in which your understanding was refined, and now your art serves truth more deeply than it ever could have, through a single perfect performance. As his boat drifted back into the network of canals, Chandra understood that she had learned the deepest lesson about time and choice, that no moment is ever truly broken beyond repair, only waiting for the compassionate understanding that can reveal how even our most regretted decisions serve the larger choreography of a life dedicated to love, wisdom, and the patient cultivation of conditions in which truth can flourish safely in an uncertain world. The Shepherd of Lost Thoughts. In the high meadows above the monastery of Hemis, where the thin air carried prayers like invisible birds across the Himalayan peaks, there lived a shepherd named Sonam, who tended not sheep or yaks, but thoughts that had wandered away from their thinkers. His flock consisted of worries that had grown too heavy to carry dreams, that had become separated from their dreamers, and ideas that had drifted so far from their original purpose that they no longer recognized their own nature. Sonam had inherited this unusual calling from his uncle, a monk who had spent 40 years in mountain caves before discovering that the most profound meditation often involved not emptying the mind, but learning to gather scattered mental energies with the same patient skill that traditional shepherds used to guide their flocks home at evening. The old monk had taught him that thoughts like sheep had their own intelligence and preferred to move in natural patterns, but sometimes needed gentle guidance to find their way back to usefulness and peace. His dwelling was a simple stone hut that seemed to grow from the mountainside itself, surrounded by terraced gardens where thoughts of different temperaments grazed peacefully together. Anxious thoughts, which appeared as small, quick-moving creatures with luminous eyes, shared the same pastures with slow, contemplative thoughts that moved like ancient tortoises, carrying entire worlds on their shells. Creative thoughts danced like butterflies between the meditation thoughts that stood still as granite monuments, each type contributing to the overall harmony of the mental ecosystem. On this particular evening, as the setting sun painted the peaks in shades of gold and crimson that had no names in any human language, a young scholar named Tenzin arrived at Sonam's meadow with the exhausted gait of someone who had been chasing his own thoughts for far too long. He was a brilliant student of Buddhist philosophy, capable of debating the finest points of doctrine with learned masters, yet he had recently discovered that his intellectual understanding had become disconnected from the simple peace that such knowledge was meant to cultivate. Tenzin's mind raced constantly with concepts, arguments, and analyses that seemed to generate more questions than answers. He could explain the nature of emptiness with scholarly precision, but could not find a moment of actual emptiness in his own experience. He understood compassion as a philosophical principle, but found himself increasingly irritated by the gap between his theoretical knowledge and his lived reality. I seek the shepherd of lost thoughts. He called out across the meadow, his voice carrying the particular strain that comes from too much thinking about thinking. I have been told that here minds that have lost their way might find direction, if not destination. Sonam emerged from his hut, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who had learned to trust that everything necessary would unfold in its proper time. He carried a shepherd's staff, carved from juniper wood, its surface smooth from years of use, and wore the simple robes of a practitioner who had found no need to distinguish between spiritual practice and daily life. "Welcome, learned one," he said, his voice carrying the clarity that develops in those who spend their days in vast open spaces. "I see you have brought quite a crowd with you." Tenzin looked around in confusion, seeing only the empty meadow and distant peaks. "I travel alone, uncle. I have brought nothing but my confusion and the weight of too much learning." Sonam smiled gently, and gestured toward the space around the young scholar. Look again, but this time with the eyes of someone who has learned to see thoughts as they truly are, not as personal possessions, but as temporary visitors in the vast space of awareness. As Tenzin relaxed his focused gaze and allowed his vision to soften, he began to perceive what the shepherd saw. Dozens of thought forms swirling around him like an agitated flock. Concepts about the nature of reality buzzed like angry bees. Half-formed arguments chased each other in circles, and fragments of memorized texts fluttered like papers caught in a whirlwind. The mental chaos that he had been carrying internally had become visible as an external phenomenon. How long have you been trying to corral these thoughts through effort and analysis? Sonam asked, settling himself on a flat stone that seemed perfectly placed for conversations about the nature of mind. Since I began my studies 5 years ago, Tenzin replied, attempting to sit in formal meditation posture, but finding himself unable to remain still. The more I learn about the Buddhist teachings, the more my mind seems to rebel against the very peace those teachings promise. I understand intellectually that thoughts are empty and permanent without inherent existence, but this understanding only creates more thoughts about the nature of thoughts. Sonam nodded with recognition, having seen this pattern countless times in scholars and practitioners who had developed powerful analytical minds, but had not yet learned to work with those minds skillfully. Tell me, he said, when you watch a traditional shepherd working with his flock, what do you observe? Tenzin considered the question, grateful for the opportunity to apply his analytical skills to something concrete. The shepherd does not fight with the sheep or try to force them into unnatural formations. He understands their nature, works with their instincts, and guides them gently toward where they need to go. And yet, Sonam continued, many spiritual practitioners believe that the mind must be forced into submission, that thoughts must be eliminated or conquered. They approach meditation like warriors preparing for battle, rather than shepherds tending their flocks. As he spoke, Sonam began to demonstrate his own method of working with thoughts. He raised his staff and made a gentle sweeping gesture, and miraculously, the chaotic swirl of thought forms around Tenzin began to settle into more natural patterns. Anxious thoughts found their way to a designated area where they could express their concerns without overwhelming the entire system. Analytical thoughts gathered in another section where they could examine and categorize to their heart's content without interfering with the need for moments of simple being. The first principle of thought shepherding, Sonam explained, is understanding that thoughts are not problems to be solved, but energies to be harmonized. Each type of thought has its proper function and natural rhythm. The difficulty arises when we try to make all thoughts serve the same purpose or operate at the same frequency. Tenzin watched in fascination as his mental environment transformed from chaos to organized activity. But surely some thoughts are more valuable than others. Surely thoughts about Dharma are more worthwhile than thoughts about mundane concerns. Oh, watch carefully, Sonam said, guiding Tenzin's attention to a section of the meadow where different types of thoughts were interacting naturally. See how the anxious thought about whether you're meditating correctly actually serves the deeper intention to practice authentically. Notice how the mundane thought about what you'll eat for dinner connects you to the body that makes spiritual practice possible. As Tenzin observed more closely, he began to see that his habit of judging thoughts as spiritual or unspiritual, valuable or worthless, was itself creating the mental turbulence he was trying to escape. The thoughts themselves were neutral phenomena, arising and passing away according to natural laws, but his relationship to them was creating the suffering he experienced. There is a practice, Sonam said, beginning to gather his scattered flock. As evening approached, that my uncle taught me when I first began this work. Instead of trying to control or eliminate thoughts, spend time each day simply observing them with the same patient attention you would give to clouds passing across the sky. He handed Tenzin a small smooth stone that seemed to pulse with its own inner warmth. This is a shepherding stone carved from the same mountain where great masters have meditated for centuries. Hold it during your practice and let it remind you that your awareness is like the vast sky, spacious enough to contain all weather without being disturbed by any of it. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Tenzin felt a profound settling in his system that he had not experienced since beginning his intensive studies. The thought forms that had been swirling around him had found their natural places in the ecosystem of his mind, each one contributing to the overall functioning without overwhelming the others. Will this peace last when I return to my studies? He asked carefully, placing the shepherding stone in his traveling pouch. Peace is not a state you achieve and then maintain. Sonam replied, guiding his flock toward their evening resting places with movements that seemed more like a dance than work. It is a relationship you cultivate with whatever arises in your experience. The scholar who has learned to shepherd his thoughts skillfully can study with the same focused intensity, but without the suffering that comes from fighting with his own mental processes. As Tenzin prepared to descend the mountain path, he paused to look back at the meadow, where thoughts of all kinds grazed peacefully under the emerging stars. What is the most important lesson for someone who tends the flock of his own mind? That the shepherd and the flock are not separate. Sonam answered his voice, carrying across the clear mountain air like a temple bell. The awareness that observes thoughts, and the thoughts themselves arise from the same source, serve the same ultimate purpose, and return to the same vast silence. When you remember this, thinking becomes not a burden to be carried, but a natural function to be appreciated, like breathing or the beating of your heart. Walking down the mountain path by starlight, Tenzin understood that he had learned something more valuable than any philosophical concept, that true wisdom lies not in transcending the mind, but in befriending it, not in silencing thoughts, but in learning to dance with them, and that the goal of spiritual practice is not to become someone different, but to relate more skillfully to who we already are, complete with all our questions, concerns, and the magnificent complexity of a human mind learning to recognize its own boundless nature. The cartographer of inner landscapes, in the ancient port city of Hoi An, where silk-laden ships arrived with the tide carrying treasures from distant kingdoms, there lived a map-maker named Adya, who charted not the external world of rivers and roads, but the vast interior territories of human emotion. Her workshop occupied a narrow building that seemed to stretch impossibly deep, its walls lined with maps that depicted not geographic features, but the subtle topography of feelings, the weather patterns of moods, and the hidden pathways that connected one emotional state to another. Adya had discovered her unique calling during a period of profound disorientation, following the sudden death of her beloved teacher, a master cartographer who had taught her that the most important territories to explore were not those found in distant lands, but those discovered in the landscape of one's own heart. In her grief, she had found herself completely lost in emotional terrain she had never navigated before, and it was in learning to map her way through that darkness that she discovered her gift for helping others chart their own inner journeys. Her maps were unlike anything found in conventional atlases. They were living documents that seemed to shift and evolve as she worked on them, responding to the emotional climate of whoever sought her guidance. Some maps glowed with warm colors, indicating regions of joy and contentment, while others showed the stark beauty of grief's mountain ranges or the swirling confusion of anxiety's foggy coastlines. Each map was unique, tailored to the specific emotional geography of its intended traveler. On this particular evening, as lanterns began to flicker to life along the Thubon River, and the scent of jasmine drifted through her open windows, a traveling healer named Kiran arrived at Adya's workshop with the weary expression of someone who had spent too long trying to navigate by landmarks that no longer seemed to exist. She was a woman whose hands carried the calluses of countless healing treatments, whose eyes held the particular depth that comes from witnessing both great suffering and remarkable recovery, yet who had recently found herself unable to locate her own center of balance. Kiran had spent 15 years moving from village to village, offering herbal remedies and energy healing to those who could not afford conventional medicine. Her reputation had spread throughout the region, and people would travel for days to receive her treatments. But 6 months ago, she had begun experiencing what she could only describe as emotional vertigo, a sense that the internal compass she had relied upon throughout her healing career was spinning wildly, unable to find true north. "I seek the cartographer of inner landscapes," Kiran announced, though her voice carried none of the confidence that usually marked her professional interactions. "I have been told that here, those who have lost their way in their own hearts might find direction, if not immediately, then eventually." Adya looked up from the map she was currently crafting, a delicate piece that seemed to show the gentle hills and valleys of someone learning to forgive themselves for past mistakes. Her hands were stained with the unique inks she used for her work substances that seemed to capture not just color, but emotional resonance, allowing her maps to serve as both visual guides and energetic tools for transformation. "Welcome, Healing One," she said, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had learned to speak as carefully as she drew. "Before we begin charting your current location, tell me about the last time you felt truly at home in your own emotional landscape." Kiran settled herself on the cushioned bench that Adya provided for clients, grateful for the opportunity to rest not just her body, but the constant vigilance she maintained in monitoring her internal state. "3 years ago," she said after a moment of consideration, "I was treating a child who had been born with a condition that caused her constant pain. I was working with her for several weeks, and one morning she smiled at me, really smiled, for the first time since I had known her. In that moment, I felt completely aligned with my purpose, completely at peace with who I was and what I was offering the world." Adya nodded, recognizing the particular quality of memory that indicated a person's true emotional home base. "And when did you first notice that this sense of alignment was no longer accessible to you?" "About 6 months ago, I began to question everything," Kiran replied, her healer's training evident in the precise way she described her symptoms. "Every treatment I offered, I wondered if I was truly helping or merely creating dependence. Every person who thanked me, I questioned whether their gratitude was genuine or simply polite. Every moment of satisfaction I felt in my work was immediately followed by doubt about my motivations, my methods, my right to call myself a healer." As Kiran spoke, Adya began pulling various supplies from the organized chaos of her workshop. Special papers that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light brushes made from materials that existed nowhere in the conventional world, and an array of inks that moved and swirled in their containers as if they were alive. She had learned that the process of creating a map was as important as the finished product, often revealing insights that could not be gained through conversation alone. "What I hear," Adya said, beginning to sketch the preliminary outline of Kiran's emotional territory, "is that you have wandered into what I call the questioning lands, a region that every authentic healer must eventually explore, but which can be treacherous to navigate without proper guidance." She showed Kieran the emerging map, which depicted a landscape split between familiar, well-traveled paths, marked with symbols of healing success and confidence, and a vast, unmapped region filled with question marks, switchback trails, and terrain that seemed to shift even as they looked at it. The difficulty, Adya continued adding delicate details that seemed to capture the exact quality of Kieran's uncertainty, is that you are trying to use the navigation tools that served you in the territory of certainty to find your way through the kingdom of necessary doubt. It's like trying to use a map of your hometown to navigate a foreign country. Kieran studied the map with the intense focus she usually reserved for diagnosing her patient's conditions. You're saying that this doubt, this questioning, is not a problem to be solved, but a territory to be explored. I'm saying, Adya replied, selecting an ink that seemed to contain actual starlight, that every master healer must eventually journey through the questioning lands if they wish to evolve from someone who applies techniques to someone who channels healing presence. The doubt you're experiencing is not evidence that you're losing your way. It's evidence that you're ready to discover a deeper level of your calling. As she worked, the map began to reveal features that Kieran had not consciously recognized. There were paths marked compassionate uncertainty that led to overlooks offering broader perspectives on the healing process. Rivers of beginner's mind flowed through regions where new approaches to helping others could be discovered. Mountain peaks, labeled humble mastery, rose from valleys where the ego's need to be the source of healing had been surrendered to something larger and more mysterious. But how do I serve my patients when I'm no longer certain about anything? Kieran asked, recognizing the accuracy of the map, but still feeling overwhelmed by the vast territory it revealed. By allowing your uncertainty to become a gift rather than a burden, Adya answered, adding final touches that showed bridges connecting the old territory of confident competence with the new landscape of wise questioning. The healer, who has learned to hold space for not knowing, often creates more genuine healing than the one who always has answers. Your patients are not looking for someone who has eliminated all doubt from their system. They're looking for someone who can accompany them with presence and skill through their own journey from suffering to wellness. She set down her brush and gestured to a section of the map that seemed to glow with particularly warm light. Look here, she said. This region represents what I call confident uncertainty, the ability to act skillfully and compassionately, even when you don't fully understand the mechanisms at work. It's the territory of the master healer who has learned to trust the healing process itself rather than their personal ability to control outcomes. As Kieran studied this section of the map, she began to see her recent struggles in an entirely different light. The doubt that had been tormenting her was actually evidence of growing wisdom, a sign that she was ready to move beyond mechanical application of healing techniques toward a more mysterious and ultimately more effective relationship with the healing arts. There is a practice, Adya said, beginning to prepare the map for travel by treating it with special preservatives that would allow it to continue evolving as Kieran's understanding deepened, that my teacher shared with me when I first began mapping emotional territories. Each morning before you begin your healing work, spend a few moments acknowledging what you don't know about the person you're about to serve. Let this not knowing become a doorway to deeper listening, more genuine presence. She handed Kieran a small compass that seemed to point not toward magnetic north, but toward something more subtle, the direction of authentic service that existed beyond personal certainty or doubt. This will help you navigate when the path becomes unclear. It doesn't point toward right answers, but toward right relationship with your patients, with your practice, with the mystery of healing itself. As the evening deepened and the sounds of the market settling into nighttime quiet drifted through the windows, Kieran felt a profound shift in her relationship to her own uncertainty. What had felt like a loss of professional competence now revealed itself as an invitation to a more mature and ultimately more effective approach to healing. "Will I ever feel that simple confidence I once had?" she asked as she prepared to leave with her new map carefully folded in her traveling bag. "You will find something better," Adia replied, cleaning her brushes with the careful attention that her work required. "You will discover the confidence that comes not from knowing all the answers, but from trusting your ability to stay present with whatever arises. You will learn that the most profound healing often happens not when we fix what is broken, but when we create space for others to discover their own innate wholeness." Walking back through the lantern-lit streets toward her lodging, Kieran understood that she had received more than a map. She had been given permission to embrace the evolution of her calling from healer as expert to healer as companion. The lessons settled into her awareness like medicine absorbed into grateful tissue. That true mastery in any healing art comes not from the elimination of uncertainty, but from learning to dance so skillfully with the unknown that our very willingness to not know becomes itself a form of healing presence, creating space for miracles that could never emerge from the constrained territory of what we think we understand. The archivist of forgotten kindnesses. In the ancient monastery of Sera, where debates rang through stone corridors, like the music of minds seeking truth, there lived an archivist named Pemba, who collected not manuscripts or sacred texts, but acts of kindness that had been forgotten by those who performed them. Her library existed in the deepest vaults beneath the monastery, where countless shelves held crystalline vessels containing moments of compassion that had faded from their giver's conscious memory, but continued to ripple through the world in ways both seen and unseen. Pemba had discovered her calling during a time of great personal darkness, when she had convinced herself that she had never contributed anything meaningful to the world's well-being. Overwhelmed by self-criticism and doubt about her own worth, she had retreated to the monastery's archives, seeking solace in ancient wisdom. There, in a forgotten corner, behind crumbling manuscripts, she had discovered a strange phenomenon: vessels that seemed to glow with their own inner light, each one containing what appeared to be captured moments of human goodness. The elderly librarian who found her there had explained that these were kindnesses that had been released into the world, but forgotten by their performers, acts of love and care that continued to exist and influence reality even when no one remembered creating them. The old monk had been tending this collection for decades, understanding that forgotten kindnesses were among the most precious treasures in existence, because they represented love given purely without expectation of recognition or reward. Her archive operated according to principles that defied ordinary understanding of time and space. Kindnesses would arrive through mysterious channels, sometimes carried by visitors who had no conscious awareness of what they brought, sometimes appearing spontaneously when someone somewhere in the world needed to remember that goodness existed even in their darkest hour. Each act of forgotten compassion was carefully catalogued according to its particular frequency of love, creating a vast library of human goodness that could be accessed by those who had lost faith in their own capacity for positive impact. On this particular evening, as butter lamps flickered in the monastery chapel above, and the sound of evening prayers echoed through the stone passages, a young teacher named Lobsang arrived at the archive entrance with the hollow-eyed expression of someone who had been carrying a burden of perceived failure for far too long. He moved with the careful steps of a person who no longer trusted his own ability to make positive contributions to the world. His shoulders curved inward, as if protecting a wound that had never properly healed. Lobsang had spent 3 years teaching children in a remote mountain village, pouring his heart into education that often seemed to make little visible difference. Many of his students struggled with poverty, family difficulties, and limited opportunities that made academic learning seem irrelevant to their daily survival. 6 months ago, he had left the village convinced that his efforts had been wasted, that he had failed to truly help any of his students, and that his idealistic dreams of making a difference through education had been naive and unrealistic. "I seek the archivist of forgotten kindnesses," he said to the seemingly empty archive, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from judging oneself a failure. "I have been told that here those who believe they have contributed nothing to the world's well-being might discover otherwise, though I suspect my case may be beyond even miraculous intervention." Pemba emerged from between the towering shelves, her robes rustling softly, as she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years organizing the invisible inventory of human compassion. She carried with her a small lamp that seemed to burn with unusual brightness, its light revealing details in the archive that remained hidden to ordinary perception. Around her, thousands of vessels hummed with barely audible frequencies, each one containing a moment when someone had chosen love over indifference, kindness over convenience. "Welcome, teacher," she said, her voice carrying the gentle authority that comes from spending years in the presence of countless acts of human goodness. "Tell me about the work you believe was fruitless, and we will explore together what fruits you may have failed to notice." Lobsang settled himself on the simple wooden stool that Pemba indicated, grateful for the opportunity to rest, not just his body, but the weight of self-condemnation he had been carrying. "For 3 years, I taught in a village where children often fell asleep from hunger, where families struggled just to survive each day, where education seemed like a luxury they could not afford. I tried to inspire them with stories of possibility, to teach them skills that might open doors to better futures, but I saw no evidence that anything I did made any real difference." As he spoke, Pemba began moving through the archive, with purpose scanning the shelves until she found the section she was looking for. A collection devoted to kindnesses performed by teachers who had worked in conditions where their impact was not immediately visible. She selected several vessels that seemed to resonate with Lobsang's energy, each one glowing slightly brighter as she brought them closer to where he sat. "Before we examine what you may have forgotten," she said, arranging the vessels on a small table where their light created complex patterns on the archive walls, "tell me about one specific moment from your teaching that felt particularly hopeless. One instance where you were certain your efforts were completely wasted." Lobsang considered the question, his mind automatically returning to the moments of greatest discouragement. "There was a girl named Dolma, perhaps 8 years old, who often came to school without having eaten. She would fall asleep during lessons, and when awake, she seemed unable to concentrate on anything we studied. One day, she told me that education was pointless because poor people like her family would always be poor, and learning about the world beyond the village only made her feel worse about her situation." Pemba nodded with understanding, recognizing the particular quality of despair that arises when someone we care about voices our own deepest fears about the futility of our efforts. She reached for one of the vessels, its surface shimmering with colors that seemed to shift between gold and silver, containing what appeared to be a scene in miniature, like a snow globe filled with light instead of snow. "Look carefully," she said, handing him the vessel. "This arrived 3 months ago, though the kindness it contains was performed much earlier. As you hold it, allow yourself to see what you may have forgotten." As Lobsang cradled the vessel in his palms, Its contents began to clarify, revealing a scene from his own classroom. He saw himself quietly placing a piece of bread on Dolma's desk each morning before school, began making it appear as if someone had simply forgotten it there so the girl could eat, without feeling like she was receiving charity. He watched himself staying after school to individually help her with lessons she had missed while sleeping, never mentioning her drowsiness, but simply providing extra support as if it were part of his normal routine. But these were just small things. Lobsang protested, even as he felt something stirring in his chest. They didn't change her fundamental situation or solve the larger problems she faced. Look deeper, Pemba instructed gently. See what these small things created in her experience, how they planted seeds that have continued growing long after you stopped witnessing their growth. As he focused more intently on the vessel's contents, the scene expanded to show the effects of his forgotten kindnesses. He saw Dolma, now several years older, helping younger children in her village with the same patient attention he had shown her. He watched her sharing food with others who were hungry, demonstrating the generosity she had learned from receiving care that came without conditions or expectations. Your kindness, Pemba explained, retrieving another vessel that seemed to contain its own weather system of gentle sunshine and warm rain, taught her that dignity and care could coexist, that help could be offered without humiliation, that someone could see her struggles without defining her by them. These lessons have shaped how she treats others, creating ripples of compassion that continue spreading through her community. She opened the second vessel, revealing another scene that took Lobsang's breath away. He saw himself working late into the evening, by lamplight, creating individualized learning materials for students who struggled with conventional lessons. He watched his past self crafting stories that featured children from mountain villages as heroes' problems that related to their actual lives, examples that honored their culture, while opening doorways to broader knowledge. I had forgotten, he whispered, recognizing the countless hours he had spent adapting curriculum to meet his students where they were, rather than where educational theory suggested they should be. I thought I was just doing what any teacher would do. Exactly. Pemba smiled, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone revealing a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. You had forgotten because your kindness was so natural, so integrated into your way of being, that you didn't recognize it as extraordinary. The most profound acts of compassion often feel ordinary to those who perform them. She guided him through vessel after vessel, each one containing kindnesses he had performed and forgotten. The way he had celebrated small achievements that other teachers might have overlooked, the extra attention he had given to shy students who rarely spoke in class, the respect he had shown for local customs and traditions, while introducing new ideas, the patience he had demonstrated with parents who were initially suspicious of education's value. But did any of it actually help them escape poverty? Lobsang asked, still struggling to reconcile his memories of apparent failure with this evidence of forgotten impact. Did any of them achieve the better futures I hoped to inspire? Pemba retrieved a final vessel, larger than the others, its contents swirling with colors and images that seemed to encompass entire life stories. Define success, she said, placing it carefully in his hands. If you measure impact only by material outcomes, you will miss the most important fruits of your teaching. As this vessel revealed its contents, Lobsang saw his former students as they were now, not necessarily wealthier or in dramatically different circumstances, but carrying themselves with dignity, treating others with respect, approaching problems with the critical thinking skills he had helped them develop. He saw Dolma teaching her own children to read using methods she had learned in his classroom. He saw a boy who had been labeled slow by others confidently explaining a concept to his younger siblings, drawing on the confidence he had gained from Lobsang's patient encouragement. True education, Pemba said, as the archive around them seemed to glow brighter in response to this revelation of forgotten impact, is not about changing external circumstances, though that sometimes happens. It is about planting seeds of dignity, curiosity, and possibility that allow people to meet whatever circumstances they face with greater wisdom and resilience. As the evening deepened and the monastery settled into its nighttime rhythm, Lobsang felt a transformation occurring in his understanding of his own life's work. The failure he had been carrying, like a stone in his chest, was dissolving, replaced by a recognition of impact that operated on levels he had never learned to perceive. There is a practice, Pemba said, beginning to return the vessels to their proper places on the archive shelves, that helps teachers remember their true work. Each morning before you engage with students, whether children or adults, pause to remember that your most important impact may be invisible to you. Plant seeds of kindness, respect, and possibility without attachment to seeing immediate results. She handed him a small, empty vessel, clear as crystal. When you perform acts of care that feel small or unnoticed, breathe the intention into this vessel. It will remind you that every moment of genuine attention you offer to another being creates effects that ripple far beyond your ability to trace them. As Lobsang prepared to leave the archive, he paused at the threshold to look back at the vast collection of forgotten kindnesses that surrounded them. How do I carry this understanding back into the world without losing it again? By remembering, Pemba replied, her lamp casting dancing shadows on the archive walls, that the teacher's highest calling is not to produce specific outcomes, but to love students so consistently and skillfully that they learn to recognize their own inherent worth and potential. When you do this, you plant forests of possibility that will provide shelter and nourishment for generations you will never meet. Walking back through the monastery corridors toward his guest quarters, Lobsang understood that he had received the most important lesson of his career, that true teaching success is measured not by external achievements, but by the quality of presence and care we bring to each encounter, trusting that seeds planted with love will find their own perfect timing, for germination often blooming most beautifully in gardens we never see. Tended by hands, we help to grow strong through the simple revolutionary act of believing in someone's potential when they cannot yet believe in it themselves. The translator of silent languages, in the mountain village of Rishikesh, where the Ganges descended from the Himalayas, carrying the prayers of countless pilgrims, there lived a translator named Indira, who specialized not in converting words from one language to another, but in bridging the gaps between different ways of understanding the world. Her translation center occupied a terraced house built into the mountainside, its rooms filled with dictionaries for languages that had no written form, the subtle communications that pass between hearts, the unspoken negotiations that occur in every relationship, the ancient dialogue between human needs and natural rhythms. Indira had developed her unusual skill during years of caring for her grandmother, a woman who had suffered a stroke that left her unable to speak, but whose eyes continued to carry entire conversations for those who had learned to read them. In those months of learning to understand communication that transcended words, Indira had discovered that most human suffering arose not from lack of love or care, but from failures in translation, moments when the language of one person's heart could not be understood by another's mind, creating chasms of misunderstanding that grew wider with each failed attempt at connection. Her work attracted visitors from across the region, couples who spoke the same language, but could no longer hear each other, parents and children separated by generational differences that seemed insurmountable, friends whose relationships had been damaged by misinterpretations of intention and meaning. Each person who sought her help brought with them a different dialect of human longing, a unique way of expressing love, fear, hope, and need that had somehow become incomprehensible to those they most wanted to reach. On this particular evening, as the first stars appeared over the sacred river, and the sound of evening prayers drifted up from the ghats below, a couple arrived at Indira's center, with the weary expressions of people who had spent years trying to communicate across what felt like an unbridgeable divide. Arjun and Meera had been married for 12 years, raised 2 children together, and shared a life that appeared harmonious from the outside, yet they had gradually lost the ability to truly understand each other's deepest concerns and needs. Arjun was a man who expressed love through action, working long hours to provide security, maintaining their home with meticulous care, anticipating practical needs before they were voiced. But his language of service had become invisible to Meera, who interpreted his busy efficiency as emotional distance and his careful planning as lack of spontaneity. She needed words of affection, moments of unhurried attention, the kind of intimate conversation that seemed to have disappeared from their relationship years ago. Myra in turn expressed her love through emotional sharing, wanting to discuss feelings, explore the subtleties of their relationship, create moments of vulnerability and connection. But her attempts at deeper communication felt overwhelming to Arjun, who interpreted her desire for emotional intimacy as criticism of his efforts to show love through reliable presence and practical support. "We seek the translator of silent languages," Meera said, speaking for both of them, as they had unconsciously agreed she would. "We have been told that here people who speak different dialects of love might learn to understand each other, though we have begun to doubt whether such understanding is possible after so many years of confusion." Indira emerged from her study, carrying with her a collection of objects that seemed ordinary at first glance, but revealed themselves to be sophisticated instruments for detecting the subtle frequencies of human communication. She had learned that translation required not just understanding different languages, but recognizing the underlying needs and fears that shaped how each person expressed themselves. "Welcome seekers of understanding," she said, her voice carrying the patience that develops in those who have spent years learning to hear what is not being said. "Before we begin translating between your different languages of love, I need to understand what each of you believes the other is trying to communicate through their way of being in the relationship." She invited them to sit in comfortable chairs, positioned not facing each other, but both angled toward a window that looked out over the flowing river, reducing the intensity of direct eye contact that had become associated with conflict in their relationship. "Arjun," she said gently, "when Meera asks you to talk about your feelings or share what's happening in your inner world, what do you hear in that request?" Arjun shifted uncomfortably, his hands automatically moving to straighten objects on the small table beside his chair. "I hear that what I'm already doing isn't enough," he said finally. "I hear that all the ways I try to show love and care are being dismissed as inadequate. I hear that I'm failing as a husband because I don't express myself the way she needs me to." Indira nodded, with understanding, recognizing the translation error that had been creating pain for both partners. "And Meera, when Arjun responds to your concerns by taking action, fixing problems, making arrangements, working harder to provide for the family, what do you hear in those responses?" "I hear that my feelings are problems to be solved, rather than experiences to be shared," Meera replied, her voice carrying the accumulated frustration of years of feeling misunderstood. "I hear that he would rather stay busy than be present with me. I hear that emotional intimacy makes him uncomfortable, so he avoids it by focusing on practical matters. As they spoke, Indira began arranging her translation instruments, objects that seemed to capture and reflect the emotional undertones of their words, revealing the fear and love that lay beneath their surface communications. One device, resembling a cross between a tuning fork and a small bell, began to resonate with a clear, sweet tone that seemed to harmonize the different frequencies of their expressions. "Listen carefully," she said, striking the instrument gently. "Both of you are speaking the same language, the language of, I love you and I'm afraid I'm not loving you well enough. But you're using different dialects of this language, and each of you has been mistranslating the other's expressions of concern as evidence of their lack of love." She guided their attention to a specially designed mirror that reflected not their physical appearances, but the emotional currents that surrounded them. In its surface, they could see the streams of care and anxiety that flowed between them, the way Arjun's practical actions carried the energy of devotion, and how Mira's requests for emotional sharing arose from her desire to deepen their connection, rather than criticize his efforts. "Arjun Se," Indira said, adjusting the mirror's angle. "What Mira calls talking about feelings is her way of inviting you into deeper intimacy. In her dialect of love, emotional sharing is not about identifying problems, but about creating the kind of closeness that makes all problems easier to bear together." The mirror's reflection showed Mira's requests for conversation not as demands or criticisms, but as invitations to a form of connection that she had learned to associate with safety and belonging. Arjun watched with growing understanding as he saw how his tendency to respond with solutions rather than presence had been interpreted as rejection of the intimacy she was offering. "And Mira," Indira continued, "what Arjun calls taking care of practical matters is his way of creating a container of safety and security within which love can flourish. In his dialect of love, consistent actions speak louder than words because they demonstrate love's reliability even when emotions fluctuate." The mirror showed Arjun's careful attention to practical details, not as avoidance of emotional connection, but as his way of ensuring that their relationship had the stable foundation necessary for deeper intimacy to develop safely. Mira began to see how her interpretation of his actions as emotional distance had missed the profound care and devotion they actually represented. The translation error, Indira explained, occurs when we assume that love should be expressed in the language we best understand, rather than learning to recognize love in the various languages others naturally speak. Both of your ways of loving are complete and valuable. They simply require translation for full understanding. She handed them each a small device that resembled a compass, but pointed not toward magnetic north, but toward the love that lay beneath surface communications. This will help you navigate conversations by recognizing the loving intention behind expressions that initially seem foreign or difficult to understand. Over the next hour, Indira guided them through exercises in mutual translation. She taught Arjun to hear Mira's requests for emotional sharing as invitations to intimacy rather than evidence of his inadequacy. She helped Mira recognize Arjun's practical care as a sophisticated form of love language that created space for the emotional intimacy she craved. "There is a practice," Indira said, as evening deepened around them and the river below reflected the light of countless stars, that helps couples become fluent in each other's dialect of love. Each morning, instead of focusing on how you want to be loved, ask yourself, how can I express love today in the language my partner best understands? She gave them a shared journal, its pages designed to help them practice translation exercises. Take turns writing about moments when you felt deeply loved, describing not just what happened, but how it made you feel. This will help you create a dictionary of each other's love language that you can refer to when communication becomes difficult. As they prepared to leave walking together down the mountain path toward their home, Both Arjun and Mira felt a lightness that had been absent from their relationship for years. The tension that had characterized their interactions was beginning to dissolve as they recognized the love that had always been present but had been lost in translation. "Will we still have misunderstandings?" Mira asked, as they paused to look back at Indira's center, now glowing softly in the darkness. "Of course," Arjun replied, surprising himself with his newfound confidence in their ability to navigate differences. "But now we have tools for translation instead of assuming the worst about each other's intentions." Walking home under the star-filled sky, they understood that they had learned the most important lesson of lasting partnership, that love is not diminished by being expressed in different languages, but enriched by the opportunity to learn new ways of giving and receiving care. The practice of translation, of seeking to understand rather than to be understood, had revealed that their differences were not obstacles to intimacy, but doorways to a deeper appreciation of the many ways that one heart can reach toward another. Each attempt at connection, a small miracle of courage and trust. Each successful translation, a victory for love's eternal determination to bridge every gap that seems to separate us from the care we both need and have to offer. The Weaver of Dawn's first light, in the sacred grove of Sarnath, where the Buddha had first turned the wheel of Dharma and set in motion teachings that would ripple through centuries like stones cast into still water, there lived a contemplative named Ananda who practiced the most subtle of all arts, weaving together the scattered insights of human experience into a seamless tapestry of understanding. Her sanctuary existed in the space between night and dawn, that liminal time when the veil between dreaming and waking becomes thin enough for deeper wisdom to emerge from the depths of consciousness. Ananda had discovered her calling during a period of profound fragmentation, when years of spiritual seeking had left her with a collection of beautiful insights that seemed to contradict each other, practices that appeared to work against one another, and understandings that felt complete in isolation but created confusion when held together. She had studied with teachers throughout the region, the merchant who collected worries, the weaver of silence, the gardener of dreams, and many others whose wisdom had illuminated specific aspects of the path toward peace. But it was in the pre-dawn hours, when her mind was clear, but not yet engaged with the day's activities, that she had discovered how to perceive the underlying pattern that connected all these different approaches to awakening, like a master weaver who could see how threads of different colors and textures could combine to create a design more beautiful than any single element. She had learned to help others integrate their various insights and experiences into a unified understanding that honored complexity while revealing simplicity. Her sanctuary was unlike any of the specialized workshops and libraries that dotted the spiritual landscape of the region. Instead of focusing on one particular aspect of human development, it contained elements that reflected the full spectrum of contemplative practice: vessels for collecting and transforming worry, looms for weaving silence gardens where abandoned dreams could take root, shelves of crystallized moments awaiting repair maps of emotional terrain, and countless other tools for the various forms of inner work that seekers might encounter on their journey toward awakening. On this particular pre-dawn morning, as the first pale light began to gather at the horizon, and the night sounds of the forest gradually gave way to the stirring of diurnal creatures, a pilgrim named Siddhartha arrived at Ananda's sanctuary with the expression of someone who had traveled far but was no longer certain of his destination. He carried with him a large traveling bag that seemed to contain more than its size should allow, and his movements suggested the particular fatigue that comes not from physical exertion, but from trying to hold too many different truths simultaneously. Siddhartha had spent the past 3 years journeying from teacher to teacher, collecting wisdom like a scholar gathering books for a vast library. He had learned to work with his anxious thoughts, to cultivate inner silence, to tend the garden of his creative impulses, to speak unspoken truths, to repair moments damaged by regret, to shepherd scattered mental energies, to navigate emotional landscapes, to recognize forgotten acts of kindness, and to translate between different languages of the heart. Each teaching had been profound and transformative, yet somehow the accumulation of insights had begun to feel overwhelming rather than clarifying. He found himself constantly switching between different practices, unable to discern which approach was most appropriate for any given situation. The tools he had gathered were magnificent individually, but he had not learned how to use them in harmony with each other. "I seek the weaver of dawn's first light," he announced to the quiet sanctuary, his voice carrying the particular confusion that arises when someone has learned much, but understood little about how to integrate their learning. "I have been told that here scattered wisdom might be woven into something whole, though I fear my collection of insights may be too tangled for even master craftsmanship to repair." Ananda emerged from her meditation as naturally as the sun emerges from behind mountains, her movements carrying the fluid grace of someone who had learned to navigate the transition between states of consciousness with skill and awareness. She seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, fully present to the physical world, yet clearly attuned to subtler levels of reality that influenced all manifest experience. "Welcome, gatherer of wisdom," she said, her voice carrying the clarity that comes from consistent practice in the hours when the mind is most naturally clear. "Before we explore the pattern that connects your various learnings, show me how you currently understand the relationship between all that you have gathered." Siddhartha set down his traveling bag and began removing the tools and teachings he had collected. Vessels for transforming worry cloths, for cultivating silence, seeds, for planting new dreams, containers for unspoken words, crystals for healing, regret stones for shepherding thoughts, maps for navigating emotions, records of forgotten kindnesses, instruments for translation between hearts. As he arranged them, the collection appeared impressive, yet somehow chaotic, like a music box that had been taken apart by someone who understood each component, but not how they functioned together. "Each teaching has helped me in specific situations," he explained, handling each item with the reverence of someone who had learned their value through direct experience. "But I find myself constantly confused about which practice to use when. If I'm experiencing anxiety, should I collect my worries like Kalindi taught, or weave silence like Tenzin, or perhaps shepherd my scattered thoughts like Sonam? The approaches seem to contradict each other, and I spend more time choosing between practices than actually practicing." Ananda studied his collection with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to perceive the subtle connections that link apparently separate phenomena. "Tell me," she said, beginning to move the various tools and teachings into a different arrangement, "what do you believe these different approaches are ultimately pointing toward?" As she repositioned the items, a pattern began to emerge that Siddhartha had not previously noticed. The vessel for collecting worries was placed near the loom for weaving silence, and suddenly he could see how working with anxious thoughts naturally led to the cultivation of inner stillness. The seeds for planting dreams were arranged beside the maps for navigating emotions, revealing how creative expression and emotional awareness supported each other in the development of authentic self-knowledge. "I see," he said slowly, recognition dawning in his understanding that they're all different ways of approaching the same fundamental work, learning to relate wisely to to whatever arises in experience, whether thoughts, emotions, dreams, relationships, or memories. Exactly. Ananda smiled, continuing to arrange his collection until it formed a mandala-like pattern, with each element supporting and enhancing the others. You have been treating these teachings as separate techniques to be applied in isolation, rather than recognizing them as different aspects of a unified practice of awakening awareness. She gestured to the center of the arrangement, where all the various tools and teachings seemed to converge around an empty space that somehow seemed more significant than any of the objects surrounding it. What do you see at the heart of this pattern? Siddhartha looked carefully, expecting to find some object or symbol that would represent the ultimate teaching or final technique he needed to master. Instead, he found only space, a clear, open awareness that was not separate from any of the practices, yet was not identical to any of them either. I see nothing, he said, though as he spoke he realized that this nothing was actually the most important element in the entire arrangement. Or rather, I see the awareness that experiences all of these different approaches, the consciousness that remains present, whether I'm working with worry, or cultivating silence, or planting dreams. Now you begin to understand the true art of integration. Ananda said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a teacher whose student has made a crucial connection. Each practice you have learned is a way of training this awareness to relate more skillfully to specific aspects of experience. But awareness itself is what remains constant, what connects all practices, what gives them their power to transform suffering into wisdom. As the sun finally crested the horizon, filling the sanctuary with golden light that seemed to illuminate not just the physical space, but the understanding emerging in Siddhartha's mind, Ananda began to demonstrate how the various practices could flow naturally into each other when guided by aware presence rather than conceptual rules. When anxiety arises, she explained, moving fluidly from one practice to another, as if performing a dance. You can collect those worries with Kalindi's method, which naturally quiets the mind enough to access Tenzin's woven silence. In that silence, Ashana's abandoned dreams may surface, asking to be tended. As you care for those dreams, Yukiko's unspoken words may emerge ready to be voiced. Speaking truth may reveal Narayan's moments needing repair, which when healed create space for Sonam's scattered thoughts to find their natural order. She continued the demonstration, showing how emotional awareness, kindness, recognition, and heart translation all flowed together when approached not as separate techniques, but as different facets of a single commitment to meeting each moment with conscious presence and compassionate response. There is a practice, Ananda said, as the full light of dawn filled the sanctuary and the sounds of the waking world began to reach them from the surrounding forest, that weaves together all the wisdom you have gathered. Each morning, as you transition from sleep to waking, spend a few moments simply resting in the awareness that will guide you through the day. Ask not, what practice should I do? But rather, what does this moment ask of me? And how can I respond with the fullness of what I have learned? She handed him a simple piece of cloth that seemed to contain threads from all the different teachers he had studied with, strands of worry collection silence, weaving dream-tending word-speaking, moment-mending thought, shepherding emotion mapping kindness, remembering and heart-translating, all woven together into a unified fabric that was both complex and remarkably simple. This will remind you, she said, that you are not a student collecting separate techniques, but a human being learning to live with greater awareness, compassion, and skill. The practices will arise naturally from this commitment, each one appearing precisely when needed, flowing into the next, without the confusion that comes from trying to choose the right approach from the outside. As Siddhartha prepared to continue his journey, no longer seeking additional teachings, but ready to integrate what he had already received, he felt a profound settling in his system that he had not experienced since beginning his spiritual quest years earlier. What is the ultimate teaching? He asked as he packed his tools with new understanding of how they worked together. That you are already whole. Ananda replied, beginning her own daily practice as the sanctuary filled with the full light of the new day. Every practice you have learned, every insight you have gained, every moment of suffering you have transformed, all of these are simply ways of remembering and embodying the completeness that was never actually absent. The spiritual path is not about becoming someone different, but about removing the obstacles that prevent you from recognizing who you have always been. Walking away from the sanctuary as the world awakened around him, Siddhartha understood that he had received the most important teaching of all, that the journey toward awakening is not about accumulating wisdom, but about learning to live from the wisdom that is our essential nature. All the scattered insights and practices he had collected were not separate tools to be applied mechanically, but expressions of a single truth, manifesting through the countless ways that awareness learns to embrace experience with unconditional love, patient presence, and the kind of skillful compassion that transforms every moment of ordinary life into an opportunity for the sacred to shine through the veil of apparent separation, revealing the fundamental unity that connects all beings in their shared longing for peace, understanding, and the deep rest that comes when we finally stop searching for what we have never actually lost.